It was sometime in 2008. I had an uncle who was a well known dermatologist in my hometown, and one day on a routine medical checkup, the radiologist found a lump in his stomach. My uncle then got himself checked by his surgeon friend, and the diagnosis was stomach cancer. Now, this surgeon was one of the best in the field and had even successfully tried a treatment on this exact cancer for other patients that had tripled the 5 year survival rate from 5% to 15%, although with a poor quality of life. My uncle was not interested in this treatment. He knew the prognosis well, and his focus now was to spend time with family and feeling as good as possible for whatever time he had on hand. A few months later, he died at home. He got no surgical treatment, no chemotherapy, no radiation. Now, the fact of life is that everybody dies. It's not a frequent topic of discussion, but doctors die too. And most doctors don't die like the rest of us. There's this landmark essay titled How Doctors Die by Ken Murray, where he writes, and I quote, "What's unusual about them is not how much treatment they get compared to most other people, but how little. Of course, like most mortal beings, even doctors don't want to die. They want to live. But they know enough about modern medicine to know its limits. And they know enough about death to know what all people fear most, which is dying in pain after being perforated with tubes, hooked up to machines, and assaulted with drugs, and dying alone without saying or hearing a few final comforting words from their loved ones. Doctors who are terminally ill also remember what the Greek physician Hippocrates, called the father of medicine, said about limits of medicine. So Hippocrates said, and I quote, "If a man demand from an art a power over what does not belong to the art, or from nature a power over what does not belong to the nature, his ignorance is more allied to madness than to lack of knowledge. For in cases where we have the mastery afforded by a natural constitution or by an art, there we may be craftsmen, but nowhere else. Whenever, therefore, a man suffers from an ill which is too strong for the means at the disposal of medicine, he surely must not even expect that it can be overcome by medicine." Quotes closed. I remember my aunt telling me how his husband, my dermatologist uncle, he shared his end of life wish with his family a few years before his death. He wanted to be sure when the time comes that no heroic measures will happen, that he will never experience during his last moments on earth someone trying to resuscitate him with aggressive and painful treatment or therapies. In a work attributed to Hippocrates, it is written that the purpose of medicine is to do away with the sufferings of the sick, to lessen the violence of the diseases, but also to refuse to treat those who are overmastered by diseases, realizing that in such cases medicine is powerless. My uncle had seemingly read Hippocrates, given that he applied his thinking right when he needed it the most. There is a study done by Stanford University School of Medicine where they found that 9 in 10 young physicians just finishing up their residencies or fellowships would not want to receive aggressive treatment if they were terminally ill. These doctors said they would opt for do not resuscitate approach should they find themselves on the receiving end of medical treatment. Maybe they have seen the suffering of their patients at the end of life and want no part of it. Yet they tend to pursue aggressive, in the name of life prolonging treatment for patients facing the same prognosis. The reasons are not as easy as they come to your mind instantly, like doctors are corrupt or they are sold at the hand of pharma companies, etc. etc. It's not always about doctors trying to make more money or because they are intentionally insensitive to their patients' desires. The core of the problem, as I have learned from my doctor friends and relatives, is a system that rewards doctors for taking action, not for talking with and guiding their patients, and not for inaction. Like a doctor friend mentioned to me recently, that even when medicine's current default is in action and to do something, there comes a tipping point in a serious illness, like I quoted Hippocrates earlier, where the patient needs to be guided towards inaction, which rarely happens because a doctor will not get paid for inaction. There are parallels that lie all around us in life, business, investment, and financial advice. We are all driven by incentives, by what we are rewarded with, and how those rewards decide what action we often take. And this brings me to the first cause of human misjudgment that Charlie Munger spoke about in his landmark speech, The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. He called it the reward and punishment superresponse tendency, which generally highlights the idea that we humans tend to respond strongly to both rewards and punishments. It suggests that when people are offered rewards or faced with punishments, their behavior may be significantly influenced or exaggerated in response. A more specific concept that is a result of this tendency is the incentives caused bias, which suggests that when we are motivated by incentives, things like financial rewards or recognition or other benefits, we may unconsciously or consciously act in ways that align with our incentives, even if it goes against our better judgment or ethical principles. Now, we are often aware that incentives matter and people can be incentivized to do required things. But the real power of incentives lies in its ability to manipulate the way our mind works at a very subconscious level. An otherwise decent man can act immorally just because he's driven by incentives at both the conscious and the subconscious levels. Once this immoral behavior starts and it pays this man well, he gets further inclined to repeat this kind of behavior while rationalizing that it isn't immoral after all. But Munger advised that we must never ever think about something else when we should be thinking about the power of incentives. And as per him, there are only a few forces more powerful than incentives. In fact, in the Psychology of Human Misjudgment, he reflected on how the power of incentives never disappointed him. He said, and I quote, I think I have been in the top 5% of my age cohort all my life in understanding the power of incentives. In all my life, I've underestimated it. And never a year passes, but I get some surprise that pushes my limit a little farther. Quotes closed. He also said, and I quote, it's present in every profession, in every human being, and it causes perfectly terrible behavior. Human nature, with its version of what I call incentive caused bias, causes this terrible abuse. Quotes closed. He then advised that sometimes the solution to a behavior problem is simply to revisit the incentives and make sure they align with the desired goal. He talks about the example of FedEx, which is one of his favorite examples of the power of incentives. The story about FedEx is that the company once faced a critical challenge, that of ensuring packages were loaded onto planes rapidly during the night shift. But they struggled to get their night shift workers to perform efficiently. Initially, they paid their employees by an hour, assuming that more time spent on the job equaled better results. However, the breakthrough came when someone questioned their approach. They realized that what the employer truly wanted was fault free, rapid performance of a specific task, that is, loading the planes. So they decided to change the incentive structure. Instead of hourly wages, they paid employees per shift and allowed them to go home when all the planes were fully loaded. And guess what? It worked like magic. You see, we humans are incredibly responsive to rewards and punishments. Like dogs, we are salivating at the very thought of a tasty treat and whimpering away with all our tails between our legs, with even the threat of something unpleasant happening. As the American writer and political activist Upton Sinclair puts it, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. The incentive cost bias causes us to make irrational, sometimes stupid, or unethical decisions due to our own incentives. There's a causal change that tends to happen within our minds. We feel good emotions about things that benefit us, we feel bad emotions for things that don't benefit us. In the same way, we tend to rationalize reasons to pursue what feels good and make up reasons to avoid what feels bad. If our incentives are lined up in such a way that we benefit from doing something, our minds set to work convincing ourselves that it must be a good thing to do. Normal people regularly ignore ethical or broader social concerns just because they stand to immediately benefit from some terrible action. Now, it's easy for you and me to sit here and say, what a bunch of stupid people. I would never do that. But we would, in fact, we do. We just cannot see how we do it because our minds cut us off from seeing it. Taken to its extreme, the incentive cost bias can turn us into not just stupid people, but monsters. Many of the atrocities of the Holocaust before the Second World War, for example, were not carried out by high ranking evil psychopaths in the Nazi military, but by regular foot soldiers who were incentivized to just follow orders. Consider the case of a person called Adolf Eichmann, the mastermind of the Holocaust. So, Eichmann was not the evil monster people expected, but rather a boring bureaucrat, simply trying to impress the bosses. In her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, political theorist Hannah Arendt, a Jew who fled Germany before Hitler's rise, concluded that aside from a desire for improving his career, Eichmann showed no trace of any psychological damage. In fact, she discredited the idea that the Nazi criminals were manifestly psychopathic and different from ordinary people. and concluded that even the most ordinary of people can commit horrendous crimes if placed in the right situation and given the correct incentives. Just consider the example of childbirth in India. Nearly every third woman in India who delivers a child in a hospital undergoes a cesarean or C section surgery, which is a rate twice of what the World Health Organization considers ideal, which is 15%. Now, apart from an increasing trend of women opting for it, one of the biggest reasons for the surging number of C sections is that they earn doctors and hospitals three times the money than normal deliveries. As per data collected by the Union Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, over 14% of the total births in 2018-19 took place through a C section in public hospitals. Just a decade ago, this number was less than half of the existing number. The scenario is the same at private hospitals that are usually blamed to be C section friendly. This is considering the fact that the surgery requires longer hospitalization, leading to higher billing. In private hospitals, C sections have doubled from 17% of the total births in 2008-9 to 34% in 2018-19. Now look at the financial services industry where bankers, stockbrokers, advisors, and relationship managers, they all missell toxic investment products and insurance policies to gullible people just because these earn them fat commissions. Long time back, I wrote about my friend's father who passed a few years ago, leaving his son investments in mutual fund schemes that totaled 192. Yes, you heard that number right. 192 mutual fund schemes in a single person's name, all recommended by an institutional financial advisor. And what was worse than the obnoxious numbers of these schemes was that each of them was brought using a different folio number. Imagine yourself holding 192 schemes in 192 folios. It's like making 192 bank deposits in 192 different bank accounts. Now imagine your dependents coming to know about this after you pass away. Their life would become even more miserable. When I came to know of this situation from my friend, I did not lay much blame on my friend's father for holding such a scary investment portfolio. He was a frail old retired man who wanted to invest as much as he can do so that his family are well off after his death. Of course, the concept of buyer beware exists in the investment industry, but think of the greedy financial advisor who creates such a big mess in an investor's and his dependent's life. Like this financial advisor who played havoc with my friend's father's money and trust, all for the sake of his commissions. Consider how investment bankers push IPOs even of bad companies and at exorbitant valuations. Warren Buffett said this about investment bankers that I quote, "We have seen firsthand that the incentives of investment bankers can sometimes be misaligned with the best interest of the shareholders. Investment bankers often receive substantial fees for their services, regardless of whether a deal ultimately benefits the shareholders or not. And this can create conflicts of interest that shareholders should be aware of." Quotes closed. There's a very wise thing that Buffett says so often. He says, "Don't ask the barber if you need a haircut." It's such a good reminder that asking someone with a vested interest in the outcome is not likely to give you an impartial answer. He has always held that experts or agents have vested interest when it comes to a business, which is why it is important to do your own research. Like he advised, do not trust forecast or projections, especially from someone who has a financial interest in making those projections. Now, incentives are not always bad. In fact, incentives are commonly used in many different situations to try to encourage us to behave positively in a certain way. We might even try to give ourselves incentives to help make a lifestyle change. Things like promising ourselves an expensive meal out if we go to a gym a certain number of times, or a vacation if we succeed in saving our money. On the other side, on the flip side, for those of us who are parents or work in management or leadership position, incentivization is often the go-to strategy to try to encourage certain kinds of good behavior from others. In general, our culture prizes rewards and punishment as a method of getting the results we want. And given how widely prevalent this mindset is, it pays to know when incentives work and when they don't, and why. Incentives such as money or reputation or knowledge or competence, promotion, etc., they almost always work. Each individual, however, makes his or her own hierarchy and determines what matters to him or her the most. Coming to the question of how can you prevent incentive caused bias while making decisions? Now, Munger recommends two ways you can guard against incentive caused bias. One is by fearing advice when it is especially good for the advisor. Like the doctor who thought that your gallbladder must come out because it's the surgery he would get paid to perform. And two, Munger advises to double check, disbelieve, or replace much of what you are told to the degree that seems appropriate after objective thought. Now, these general antidotes Munger offers should encourage us to maintain a healthy skepticism and actively engage with the advice we receive. And by learning the basics of an advisor's field and critically assessing their recommendations, we can navigate the potential pitfalls of incentive caused bias. You see, both your conscious and subconscious thoughts and behaviors are constantly influenced by incentives, just as of those around you. However, there's no need to worry because you are already ahead of the curve now. You've grasped the incredible superpower that incentives hold, and you'll soon start recognizing them in action within your life. You'll challenge your preconceived notions and uncover the motivations behind your own actions. It's hard to overemphasize just how potent and powerful incentives can be. And as always, let's remember Charlie's sage advice when he said, never ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives. With this, thank you for joining me on this exploration of incentives and their impact on human behavior. If you found this video informative, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more thought provoking content. And remember, understanding the psychology of incentives can empower you to make better choices in life, investing, and everywhere. Until we meet next time, stay curious and stay mindful of the incentives that drive you and those around you. Thank you so much.